Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine a river. Not a small river, not the kind of river you can throw a stone across or wade through on a summer afternoon. Imagine a river so wide that standing on one bank, the other side disappears into haze. A river so long that it touches parts of the country that feel like entirely different worlds. A river that moves so much water, so constantly, so relentlessly, that the land around it has been shaped by its will for millions of years before a single human being ever stood on its banks. Now imagine that this river, this enormous, ancient, unstoppable river, became the central artery of an entire civilization. Imagine that for centuries everything that mattered moved along it. Food, raw materials, finished goods, people searching for a better life, ideas spreading from one community to the next, wealth accumulating in the hands of those who understood how to use the river, and poverty settling on those who did not. Imagine that the rhythm of the river became the rhythm of commerce, and the rhythm of commerce became the rhythm of daily life for millions of people spread across the heart of a continent. That river is the Mississippi, and this is its story. Not the geological story, though that is extraordinary in its own right. Not the story of the indigenous nations who lived along its banks for thousands of years before European contact, though their relationship with the river was profound and deserves far more attention than it usually receives. This is the story of the Mississippi as a commercial artery, as the economic spine of a young and rapidly expanding nation, as the subject of political battles, technological revolutions, ecological transformations, and human ambitions that shaped the United States in ways we are still living with today. It is, in the truest sense, a slow story. Not slow in the sense of being unimportant, slow in the sense that the most significant changes happened gradually, over decades and generations, in ways that were often invisible to the people living through them. The Mississippi River trade did not transform overnight. It shifted year by year, responding to new technologies and new economics and new political realities, until the river that exists today is almost unrecognizable compared to the river of 200 years ago. That transformation is what we are going to trace together. And before we go any further, I want to take just a moment to say something directly to you. This channel is built on a very simple belief that slow, deep, careful history is worth making, that the stories hiding inside ordinary things, rivers, roads, lampposts, trade routes, are some of the most revealing stories about who we are and how we got here. Making content like this takes an enormous amount of time and research and genuine care. If you are finding value in this journey, if you are the kind of person who appreciates history told at the pace it deserves, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and the bell notification so you never miss a video. It is the single most meaningful thing you can do to support this work, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Now, let us get back to the river. The Mississippi River is, by almost any measure, one of the most significant rivers on the planet. It drains roughly 40% of the continental United States, collecting water from 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces across a watershed of approximately 1.2 million square miles. From its headwaters at Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota, where the river is narrow enough to step across, it flows southward for roughly 2,340 miles before emptying into the Gulf of Mexico south of New Orleans. Along the way, it collects the waters of the Missouri River, the Ohio River, the Arkansas River, the Tennessee River, and dozens of other significant tributaries.
The volume of water the Mississippi carries is difficult to fully comprehend. At its mouth, near New Orleans, the river discharges an average of roughly 600,000 cubic feet of water per second into the Gulf. During flood periods, that number can rise to several times the average. The sediment carried by all of this water has, over geological time, built the entire delta region of southern Louisiana, creating land from the accumulated material washed down from the heart of a continent. This physical reality, the sheer enormous scale, is the foundation on which everything else in this story rests. Rivers have always been highways. Long before roads were built or railroads were dreamed of, rivers were the most efficient means of moving people and goods across large distances. Water offers far less resistance to movement than land. A boat can carry far more cargo than a pack animal or a wagon, and can do so with far less expenditure of energy. In a world without engines, where all transportation depended ultimately on muscle power, the ability to float downstream with a heavy load was an economic advantage of the first order. The Mississippi offered this advantage at a continental scale. The earliest European explorers who traveled the Mississippi understood its commercial potential almost immediately. Hernando de Soto led the first European expedition to reach the Mississippi, crossing it somewhere in the vicinity of present-day Memphis in 1541. René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle traveled the entire length of the river in 1682, reaching the Gulf of Mexico and claiming the entire Mississippi watershed for France, naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. La Salle understood clearly what he was claiming. The Mississippi and its tributaries gave access to the interior of a continent of unknown but obviously enormous extent. Whoever controlled the river controlled the trade of that interior, and the trade of that interior in furs, in agricultural products, in whatever resources the land might yield, was potentially worth more than anyone could yet calculate. The French established New Orleans at the mouth of the river in 1718, and the strategic logic of that choice was unmistakable. The city sat at the point where everything coming down the river had to pass before reaching the sea. It was, in commercial terms, a choke point of almost unparalleled value. The city that controlled New Orleans controlled the economic fate of everything upstream. This geographic reality would shape the politics and economics of the Mississippi River trade for well over a century. It would be the reason why Thomas Jefferson considered the acquisition of New Orleans one of his presidency's most important diplomatic objectives. It would be the reason why the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was greeted with such overwhelming relief by the farmers and merchants of the interior who depended on the river to get their goods to market. And it would be the reason why the fall of New Orleans to Union forces in 1862 was understood by both sides in the Civil War as a potentially decisive blow to the Confederate economy. But we are moving ahead of ourselves. Before we reach the steam era and the political crises and the technological revolutions, we need to understand the Mississippi River trade in its earliest American incarnation. Before the steamboat, before the railroad, before any of the transformations that would reshape the river so dramatically. We need to understand the flatboat. The flatboat was, in its essentials, exactly what the name suggests, a flat-bottomed wooden boat, typically rectangular in shape, built to carry cargo downstream on a river current. It had no engine, no sail of practical use on the interior rivers, and no ability to travel upstream against the current. It was a one-way vessel, built for a single journey, and at the end of that journey it was typically broken up and sold for lumber. The flatboat was the workhorse of the early Mississippi River trade, and understanding it is essential to understanding the world that existed before the steamboat changed everything. We will explore that world in close detail as we continue this journey together. The river is waiting, and it has a great deal to tell us.
Picture a riverbank somewhere along the Ohio River in the early 1800s, just before dawn. A crowd has gathered. Farmers, craftsmen, families who have spent the better part of a year preparing for this single moment. Stacked along the muddy bank are barrels of flour, crates of whiskey, bundles of furs, slabs of salted pork, and dozens of other goods that represent an entire season, sometimes an entire year of hard labor. All of it is waiting to be loaded onto a long, low, unglamorous wooden box of a boat that will carry it hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles downstream. This was the flatboat, and for the first few decades of American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, it was the only practical way to get anything to market. Before we go further into this story, I want to pause for just a moment and speak with you directly, the way I try to do in every video on this channel. Stories like this take a genuinely long time to research and write carefully, because I want every detail to be accurate and every chapter to actually deserve your attention. If you are enjoying this journey down the Mississippi so far, the most helpful thing you can possibly do is subscribe to this channel right now. It really does make a difference, and it costs you nothing at all. Now let us get back to the river, because there is a great deal more to understand about the world the flatboat created. To understand why the flatboat mattered so much, you have to understand the geography of early American settlement. In the decades following the American Revolution, large numbers of settlers began moving across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley and beyond. Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and eventually Indiana and Illinois were filling with farming families who were producing more grain, more livestock, and more raw materials than they could possibly consume themselves. This was the entire point of frontier agriculture. Families cleared land, planted crops, and hoped to produce a surplus large enough to sell for cash or trade for the manufactured goods they could not produce themselves, things like tools, cloth, salt, and gunpowder. But producing a surplus was only useful if you could get it to a market. And this is where the geography of the young United States created a profound and persistent problem. The obvious market for settlers in the Ohio Valley was the eastern seaboard, the established cities of Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York, where population density created demand and where ships could carry goods onward to international markets. But the Appalachian Mountains stood directly between the western settlements and the eastern cities. Moving goods overland across those mountains on the primitive roads that existed in this period was slow, expensive, and often simply impractical for anything beyond the most valuable and compact goods. A farmer in Kentucky who tried to haul a wagon load of corn over the mountains to Philadelphia would spend more money on the journey than the corn itself was worth by the time it arrived. The economics simply did not work. For bulk agricultural goods, the eastern market was effectively unreachable. But there was another direction to look, south and west, toward the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. This was the genius and the necessity of the flatboat trade. Rather than fighting the mountains, settlers in the Ohio Valley used the natural flow of the river system to their advantage. The Ohio River flowed west and then joined the Mississippi, which flowed south all the way to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico, where goods could be loaded onto ocean-going ships and sent anywhere in the world. The current did the work. All a farmer needed was a boat sturdy enough to hold his cargo and a crew willing to make the journey.
The flatboats themselves were remarkably simple vessels, built by people with relatively modest carpentry skills, using lumber that was often cut directly from trees on the farmer's own land. A typical flatboat might be 60 to 100 feet long and 15 to 20 feet wide, with a flat bottom that drew very little water, allowing it to navigate the shifting channels, sandbars, and shallow stretches that characterized much of the river system. The sides were built up with wooden planking, sometimes with a roofed section to protect cargo and crew from the weather, giving many flatboats the appearance of a long, floating shed. There was no engine. There was, in any meaningful sense, no real steering mechanism beyond long oars called sweeps, mounted at the front and rear of the boat, which the crew used to nudge the vessel away from obstacles and to help guide it through bends in the river. The flatboat did not fight the current. It surrendered to it almost entirely, drifting downstream at the speed of the water itself, with the crew working primarily to avoid collisions rather than to control direction in any active sense. This made flatboat travel slow by any modern standard, but remarkably efficient for its time. A journey from the Ohio Valley to New Orleans might take anywhere from a month to 2 months, depending on water levels, weather, and the specific route taken. Given that the alternative was an overland journey across mountains that was barely feasible at all for bulk goods, a month or two floating downstream was an enormous improvement. The flatboat trade created an entire seasonal rhythm of economic life across the Ohio Valley and the upper Mississippi region. Farmers would spend the year producing their surplus crops and goods. In late autumn or winter after harvest, they would build or purchase a flatboat, load it with everything they intended to sell, and set off downstream. Often, neighboring farmers would pool their goods onto a single boat, sharing the costs and the labor of the journey. Sometimes a farmer would build the boat with the specific intention of selling the lumber itself in New Orleans, since timber was valuable in the largely treeless lower Delta region. The crews who manned these boats, often called boatmen, occupied a distinctive and somewhat notorious place in American frontier culture. The journey downriver required physical endurance, practical skill in handling the boat through difficult stretches of water, and a willingness to spend weeks living in close quarters with relatively little comfort. River towns along the route, particularly larger settlements where boats might stop to resupply or trade, developed reputations for the rowdy behavior of boatmen passing through, spending money earned from their cargo sales and blowing off the accumulated tension of a long and physically demanding journey. New Orleans itself, as the final destination for most of this river traffic, experienced a remarkable seasonal transformation. During the months when flatboat traffic peaked, the riverfront of the city would fill with hundreds of boats tied up along the levee, their cargoes being unloaded, inspected, weighed, and sold. The waterfront became a sprawling, chaotic marketplace with merchants, buyers, and boatmen all negotiating prices for the agricultural products flowing in from a watershed that stretched all the way to the edges of the known American frontier. This trade was enormously important to the economic development of the early American interior. Without the flatboat and the river system that made it possible, the rapid settlement of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio in the decades following American independence would have been far more difficult, because settlers would have had little practical way to convert their agricultural surplus into cash and goods needed to sustain a growing frontier economy. The flatboat solved, in a rough and imperfect way, a problem that geography had made nearly intractable. But the flatboat trade had a fundamental and obvious limitation, one that becomes clear the moment you think carefully about how it worked. It was a one-way system. A flatboat could carry cargo downstream with the current, but it had no practical way of returning upstream against that same current, carrying a similarly large load. The boats themselves were typically disassembled in New Orleans and sold as lumber, since rowing or poling such a large, heavy vessel back upstream against the Mississippi's current was simply not feasible with the technology available. This meant that the boatmen who had traveled downstream for a month or two needed another way to get home. Many of them walked. The Natchez Trace, a trail running from Natchez, Mississippi up through Tennessee, became one of the most heavily traveled overland routes in early America, specifically because it served as the return path for thousands of boatmen each year, walking back to the Ohio Valley after selling their cargo and their boats in the lower river towns. This one-way limitation represented the central economic problem of the flatboat era. The river could carry the wealth of the interior outward to the world. It could not yet carry the world's goods back inward with any comparable ease. Something was needed that could fight the current, something with enough power to move not just downstream with the natural flow of the water, but upstream against it, carrying heavy cargo at a pace and a cost that made two-way trade genuinely viable for the first time. That something was already being developed in workshops and on test runs along eastern rivers by inventors and engineers who were racing to solve one of the most consequential mechanical problems of their age. And when it finally arrived on the Mississippi, it would not simply improve the existing system, it would replace it entirely, transforming the river, the cities along its banks, and the economic life of the entire American interior in the span of just a few decades. The steamboat was coming.
And the story of its arrival, its rapid spread, and its complete reshaping of the Mississippi River trade is one of the most dramatic technological transformations in early American history. We will follow that story closely as we continue. On a January morning in 1812, a strange and unfamiliar sound drifted across the water near Natchez, Mississippi. It was not the sound that people along the river had grown used to hearing. It was not the creak of timber or the splash of long oars or the shouted commands of a flatboat crew navigating a bend. It was something mechanical, rhythmic, a deep, churning, hissing sound that grew steadily louder as its source came into view around the bend in the river. What the people on shore were watching was the New Orleans, a steam-powered vessel making its way down the Mississippi River. And what they were witnessing, though most of them could not have fully understood it at the time, was the beginning of the end for the world the flatboat had created. Before we continue with this remarkable story, I want to take a moment to speak with you directly, as I always try to do. Putting together a video like this involves a tremendous amount of careful research because I never want to simplify history in a way that loses its texture or its truth. If this story has held your attention so far, please take just a few seconds to subscribe to this channel. It is a small action on your part, but it genuinely helps determine whether stories like this one continue to get made. Now, back to that strange and historic sound on the river near Natchez. The steamboat did not appear suddenly out of nowhere. It was the product of decades of experimentation with steam power, building on advances that had originated in Britain during the early Industrial Revolution and had been adapted by a series of ambitious American inventors and entrepreneurs. The engine itself had been developed primarily for pumping water out of coal mines in Britain, where the technology of Thomas Newcomen and later James Watt had solved a pressing industrial problem.
But inventors on both sides of the Atlantic quickly recognized that an engine capable of producing continuous mechanical motion had applications far beyond pumping water. If a steam engine could turn a wheel, that wheel could turn a paddle, and a paddle pushing against water could propel a boat forward, independent of wind, current, or the limits of human or animal muscle. Several inventors experimented with steamboats in the late 18th century with varying degrees of success. John Fitch demonstrated a working steamboat on the Delaware River as early as 1787, and James Rumsey conducted his own experiments around the same period. But these early efforts, while technically significant, did not produce a commercially viable or widely adopted vessel. The engines were inefficient, the designs were often impractical for sustained commercial use, and the financial backing needed to develop the technology further was difficult to secure. The figure most commonly and most accurately credited with making the steamboat commercially practical was Robert Fulton, working in partnership with the wealthy and politically connected Robert Livingston. Fulton was not necessarily the most original, inventive mind working on steam navigation, but he was extraordinarily skilled at synthesizing existing ideas into a workable, reliable design, and Livingston provided the financial resources and the political connections needed to secure exclusive navigation rights and bring the technology to market. In 1807, Fulton's steamboat, originally named the North River Steamboat and later popularly known as the Clermont, successfully traveled up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany, a distance of about 150 miles, in approximately 32 hours. This journey, against the river's current, would have been entirely impossible for a flatboat and grueling even for a keelboat crew. Fulton's steamboat accomplished it on a predictable schedule, carrying passengers who paid for the privilege. The success of the Clermont on the Hudson immediately raised an obvious question among ambitious entrepreneurs across the country. If steam power could conquer the Hudson, could it conquer the Mississippi? The Mississippi presented challenges that the Hudson did not. It was far longer, far more remote from established centers of industry and capital, and far less predictable in its currents, depths, and obstacles. Sandbars shifted from season to season. Fallen trees, called snags, lurked beneath the surface in unpredictable locations, capable of tearing open the hull of a boat that struck them. The river's current was significantly stronger than the Hudson's in many stretches, meaning any steamboat attempting to travel upstream would need considerably more power. Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston, recognizing the potential of the western rivers, partnered with Nicholas Roosevelt, an engineer and entrepreneur, to build a steamboat specifically designed for Mississippi River conditions. The result was the New Orleans, the very vessel that startled onlookers near Natchez in that January of 1812. The voyage of the New Orleans was, in many respects, a genuine adventure story. The boat departed from Pittsburgh in the autumn of 1811, traveling down the Ohio River towards its junction with the Mississippi. Nicholas Roosevelt's wife, Lydia Roosevelt, was aboard for much of the journey, pregnant at the time, which gives some sense of the confidence the Roosevelts had in the vessel, or perhaps simply the limited alternatives they had available. The timing of this voyage placed it directly in the middle of one of the most significant natural disasters in American history up to that point. In December of 1811 and into early 1812, a series of massive earthquakes, now known as the New Madrid earthquakes, struck the region around what is now the Missouri Boot Heel, an area the New Orleans was passing through during its voyage. These earthquakes were powerful enough to be felt across most of the eastern United States, and along the Mississippi River itself, they caused riverbanks to collapse, created new islands, destroyed existing ones, and in some accounts even caused stretches of the river to temporarily reverse direction. The crew of the New Orleans experienced these earthquakes directly during their voyage, navigating a river that was literally being reshaped by geological violence around them. That the vessel survived this journey and arrived successfully in New Orleans in January of 1812 was, by any measure, a remarkable technical and human achievement. The arrival of the New Orleans in the city for which it was named marked the symbolic beginning of the steamboat era on the Mississippi. But symbolic beginnings and practical transformations are not the same thing, and it took time, refinement, and a great deal of additional engineering work before steamboats became a fully reliable and economically dominant force on the river. The early steamboats, including the New Orleans itself, were not actually well suited to round-trip travel on the Mississippi system. The New Orleans was deep-hulled, designed more in the manner of an ocean-going or Hudson River vessel, and it struggled with the shallow, shifting waters of the upper Mississippi and the Ohio River. In fact, the New Orleans never completed a round trip back to Pittsburgh. It operated as a one-way downstream vessel, eventually striking a snag and sinking in 1814. The real breakthrough in Mississippi steamboat design came from a different engineering approach, one that abandoned the deep hull designs borrowed from ocean and Hudson River vessels in favor of something specifically adapted to the unique conditions of western rivers. This new design, often associated with engineer Henry Shreve, featured a shallow, flat-bottomed hull, more reminiscent of the old flatboats, with the engine and boiler placed on the deck above the waterline rather than below it. This design choice might sound like a minor technical detail, but its implications were enormous. By raising the heavy machinery above the hull rather than embedding it within a deep keel, engineers could build boats that drew only a few feet of water, allowing them to navigate the shallow, sandbar-strewn channels of the upper Mississippi, the Ohio, and countless tributaries that the deep-hulled early steamboats simply could not access. The phrase that later became associated with these vessels, that a Mississippi steamboat could navigate on a heavy dew, was an exaggeration, but only a slight one. Henry Shreve, for whom the city of Shreveport, Louisiana is named, built his steamboat, the Washington, in 1816, incorporating these design innovations along with a high-pressure steam engine that provided significantly more power relative to its size and weight than earlier low-pressure designs. The Washington successfully completed a round trip between Louisville and New Orleans, traveling both downstream and, crucially, upstream against the current in a fraction of the time that a keelboat would have required. This was the moment when the fundamental economic limitation of the flatboat era, the inability to move goods efficiently upstream, was finally and decisively solved. The implications rippled outward immediately. A round trip from New Orleans to Louisville that might have taken a keelboat crew several months of grueling physical labor could be completed by a steamboat in a matter of weeks. And unlike the flatboat, which was built for a single one-way journey and then dismantled, the steamboat could make this round trip again and again, year after year, amortizing its construction cost across dozens or even hundreds of voyages. The economic logic was overwhelming, and the adoption of steamboat technology on the Mississippi system accelerated with remarkable speed once the Shreve-style shallow draft design proved itself reliable. In 1814, there were perhaps 20 steamboats operating on the western rivers. By the early 1930s, that number had grown into the hundreds.
By the 1850s, at the height of the steamboat era, well over 1,000 steamboats were operating across the Mississippi River system at any given time. This rapid proliferation of steamboats transformed nearly every aspect of life and commerce along the river, and in our next part, we will explore exactly how. We will look at how steamboats reshaped the cities along the Mississippi, how they changed what could be grown, produced, and sold in the American interior, how a new and dangerous culture grew up around steamboat racing and steamboat disasters, and how the steamboat became, for several remarkable decades, the single most important piece of technology in American economic life west of the Appalachian Mountains. The river that had once been a one-way conduit for raw agricultural goods drifting slowly toward the sea was becoming something entirely different, a genuine two-way highway carrying not just cotton and corn and tobacco downstream, but manufactured goods, immigrants, ideas, news, and money flowing back upstream with a speed that would have seemed like magic to the flatboat crews of just a generation before. We will follow that transformation closely as we continue this story together.
By the 1830s and 1840s, the Mississippi River had become something that would have been almost unimaginable to a flatboat crew working the same waters just a generation earlier. It had become a corridor of genuine speed, of predictable schedules, of a kind of commercial confidence that simply had not existed when every journey downstream was a one-way commitment and every journey back was a matter of walking for weeks along a forest trail. The steamboat had not just improved the river trade, it had reorganized the entire economic geography of the American interior around a new and much faster rhythm. Before we go further into this transformation, I want to take a moment, as I do in each part of this story, to speak with you directly. Research like this takes real time and real care because getting the details right matters to me, and I hope it matters to you too. If you have found value in this journey so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the simplest way to support work like this, and it genuinely helps keep these long, careful histories coming. Now let us return to the river, because the golden age of the steamboat has a great deal more to teach us. The most immediate and visible effect of the steamboat era was on the cities that lined the Mississippi and its major tributaries. New Orleans, already the dominant commercial center at the mouth of the river, experienced an extraordinary period of growth during the steamboat decades. The city's population and wealth expanded dramatically as it solidified its position as the primary export point for the agricultural wealth of an enormous interior region. Cotton, in particular, became the dominant commodity flowing through New Orleans during this period, as the cotton-growing regions of the lower Mississippi Valley expanded rapidly to meet the seemingly insatiable demand of textile mills in Britain and the northeastern United States. By the 1840s and into the 1850s, New Orleans had become one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, and its wealth was overwhelmingly tied to its function as the funnel through which river commerce passed on its way to the wider world. The levee along the Mississippi in New Orleans during this period was, by all contemporary accounts, an extraordinary sight, lined for miles with steamboats tied up 3 and 4 abreast, their cargo being loaded and unloaded by enormous numbers of dock workers, many of them enslaved people, whose forced labor was central to the functioning of the entire cotton economy that the river trade served. This is a point worth sitting with directly, because it is impossible to tell an honest history of the antebellum Mississippi River trade without confronting the role of slavery within it.
The steamboat economy of the lower Mississippi Valley was deeply and inextricably intertwined with the institution of slavery. The cotton that filled steamboat cargo holds was grown and harvested by enslaved labor on plantations throughout the lower valley. The river itself became an instrument of the domestic slave trade, with enslaved people transported by steamboat from the upper South to the expanding cotton frontier of the deep South, a forced migration that separated families and reshaped the demographic landscape of the entire region. Understanding the Mississippi River trade in this period requires understanding that its prosperity was built in significant part on this profound human cost. Further upriver, other cities were experiencing their own versions of steamboat-driven transformation. St. Louis, positioned near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, grew into a major commercial hub, serving as the gateway to trade with the expanding western frontier. Louisville, on the Ohio River, became an important point for goods moving between the eastern manufacturing centers and the Mississippi system. Memphis, Natchez, Vicksburg, and Baton Rouge all grew as river towns whose economic fortunes rose and fell with the volume and value of steamboat traffic passing their docks. Cincinnati emerged as one of the most significant manufacturing centers in the entire Mississippi River system, earning the nickname Porkopolis for its enormous meatpacking industry, which depended heavily on steamboat transport to bring in livestock from surrounding farming regions and to ship out processed pork products to markets throughout the river system and beyond. The relationship between Cincinnati's industrial growth and the steamboat trade illustrates something important about this period. The steamboat did not just move existing agricultural products to market more efficiently, it enabled entirely new patterns of economic specialization, allowing cities to develop manufacturing and processing industries that depended on reliable, affordable transportation of raw materials in and finished goods out. The steamboat also transformed what ordinary people could realistically grow, produce, and sell. Under the flatboat system, only goods that could survive a slow, one-way journey downstream and that commanded enough value to justify the cost and risk of that journey were practical to ship to distant markets. Under the steamboat system, with its faster transit times and round-trip capability, a much wider range of goods became commercially viable, including perishable items that could not have survived the older, slower system. This shift had ripple effects throughout the agricultural economy of the Mississippi Valley. Farmers could now consider growing crops and raising livestock with an eye towards more distant and more lucrative markets, knowing that steamboat transport could move their products quickly enough to preserve their value. The diversity and the volume of agricultural production across the Mississippi watershed expanded considerably during the steamboat decades, encouraged by the knowledge that a faster, more reliable transportation system existed to carry that production to market.
The passenger experience of steamboat travel also deserves attention because it represented its own kind of transformation in American life. For the wealthy, steamboat travel on the Mississippi during this period could be a genuinely luxurious experience. The largest and most elegant steamboats featured ornately decorated passenger cabins, fine dining rooms, and social spaces that rivaled the finest hotels of the era. These vessels became floating symbols of American prosperity and ambition, and the steamboat captains who commanded them often became minor celebrities in their own river towns. But steamboat travel was also democratizing in important ways. For ordinary settlers, immigrants, and travelers of more modest means, steamboats offered a way to move across vast distances at a fraction of the time, and often a fraction of the cost of overland travel. The flow of people moving into and through the Mississippi Valley accelerated considerably as steamboat travel became more widely available, contributing to the rapid settlement and population growth of the American interior during this period. This golden age, however, came with a dark and dangerous underside that cannot be left out of any honest telling of this history. Steamboats of this era were, by any modern safety standard, extraordinarily dangerous machines. The high-pressure steam engines that gave them their speed and power advantage also carried significant risks of catastrophic boiler explosions. Boiler technology and safety engineering in this period lagged considerably behind the commercial pressure to build faster, more powerful vessels, and the result was a disturbingly regular pattern of steamboat disasters throughout the antebellum period. Boiler explosions could be catastrophic, instantly destroying the forward sections of a vessel and killing or injuring everyone nearby, often followed by fires that consumed what remained of the wooden hull. Snags, sandbars, and collisions with other vessels added further hazards, as did the practice of steamboat racing, in which competing captains would push their engines beyond safe operating limits in order to win informal races against rival boats, sometimes resulting in exactly the kind of boiler failures that everyone understood to be a risk, but that commercial pressure and personal pride encouraged regardless. The cumulative toll of these disasters across the steamboat era was substantial. Historians estimate that thousands of people died in steamboat accidents on American rivers during the 19th century, a sobering statistic that stands alongside the genuine economic and social transformation that steamboats brought to the Mississippi Valley. The frequency of these disasters eventually prompted federal regulatory action, including the Steamboat Inspection Service established in the 1850s, one of the earliest examples of federal safety regulation of a private industry in American history, though enforcement and effectiveness varied considerably in the years before the Civil War. The steamboat era also intersected with one of the defining political crises of 19th century America. As sectional tensions between North and South intensified through the 1850s, the Mississippi River occupied a strange and significant position in the national imagination. It was simultaneously a unifying force, binding the agricultural interior to markets both north and south through commercial ties that crossed the eventual lines of secession, and a potential flashpoint, a strategic asset whose control would become a central military objective once war actually broke out. When the Civil War began in 1861, both the Union and the Confederacy understood immediately that control of the Mississippi River was of enormous strategic importance. The Union's overall military strategy, often referred to informally as the Anaconda Plan, specifically identified control of the Mississippi as one of its central objectives, intended to split the Confederacy in two and cut off the Western Confederate states from the eastern ones, while simultaneously restoring the river as a commercial artery for Union-aligned interests. The military campaigns fought along the Mississippi during the Civil War, culminating in the fall of Vicksburg in July of 1963, effectively gave the Union complete control of the river for the remainder of the war. President Lincoln himself described this achievement in terms that emphasized exactly the commercial significance we have been tracing throughout this story, noting that the river again ran unvexed to the sea, a phrase that directly invoked the decades of commercial development that the war had temporarily disrupted. The Civil War, in other words, was not simply fought near the Mississippi or across the Mississippi. In a very real sense, it was fought over the Mississippi, because both sides understood with complete clarity what this story has been demonstrating from its earliest chapters. Whoever controlled this river controlled an enormous share of the economic lifeblood of the American interior. But even as the steamboat reached the absolute height of its dominance during these decades, a new and entirely different technology was beginning to emerge along the eastern seaboard and was steadily expanding westward. A technology that did not depend on rivers at all, that could be built in a straight line across land regardless of where natural waterways happened to flow, that would, within a remarkably short span of time, begin to challenge and eventually surpass the steamboat as the dominant force in American interior transportation. The railroad was coming, and its arrival would mark the beginning of the next great transformation in the long and slow story of the Mississippi River trade. We will turn to that transformation next.
There is a particular kind of historical irony that appears again and again throughout the story of American transportation, and the Mississippi River trade offers one of its clearest examples. The steamboat had triumphed over the flatboat by solving a problem the flatboat could never solve: the inability to travel efficiently upstream against the current. But the very thing that made the steamboat so revolutionary, its dependence on the river itself, was about to become its fundamental limitation, because a new technology was emerging that did not need a river at all. It did not care which direction the water happened to be flowing, or whether a channel was deep enough to float a hull, or whether a sandbar had shifted overnight and closed off a passage that had been opened the week before. The railroad simply went where the rails were laid, and rails could be laid almost anywhere. Before we continue with this part of the story, I want to take a moment to speak with you directly, as I always do. These videos take a genuinely significant amount of time to research properly, because I care about getting the texture of history right, not just the broad outline. If this story has been worth your time so far, I would be sincerely grateful if you subscribe to this channel. It is a small gesture, but it makes a real difference in whether projects like this one continue. Thank you, genuinely. Now let us return to the river and to the technology that would slowly but decisively reshape its commercial importance. The early American railroad industry developed largely along the eastern seaboard during the 1830s and 1840s, initially conceived as a way to connect specific cities or to move goods relatively short distances between established commercial centers. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, was among the earliest significant American railroad ventures, and its very name reflects the original ambition behind much of early railroad development: to connect the established eastern port cities directly with the resources and markets of the Trans-Appalachian interior, bypassing the long water route through the Gulf of Mexico entirely. This ambition should sound familiar because it directly echoes the problem that the flatboat trade had originally solved in reverse. Just as settlers in the Ohio Valley had once needed a way to move their agricultural surplus to market without crossing the Appalachian Mountains by wagon, Eastern merchants and manufacturers wanted a way to access the wealth of the interior without depending entirely on the long, slow, increasingly congested river route through New Orleans. The railroad offered a solution that the river system, for all its commercial importance, could never provide: directness. A railroad could be built in essentially a straight line between 2 points, regardless of the terrain in between, limited only by the engineering challenges of grading, bridging, and tunneling, which were considerable but solvable with sufficient capital and determination. A shipment of goods moving from Cincinnati to New York by river and ocean route had to travel down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, around the Gulf of Mexico, and up the Atlantic coast, a journey in well over 2,000 miles. A direct rail route between the same two cities could potentially cover the distance in a small fraction of that mileage. Distance in transportation economics translates directly into time and cost, And by the 1840s and 1850s, American railroad construction was accelerating rapidly enough that this fundamental advantage was beginning to reshape commercial decision-making across the entire eastern half of the country. It is important to understand that this transformation did not happen suddenly or completely. For a significant period, roughly from the 1840s through the 1860s, railroads and steamboats coexisted in a complex relationship that was sometimes competitive and sometimes complementary. Railroads often served as connectors to river and canal systems rather than as wholesale replacements for them, extending the reach of water-based commerce into areas that rivers did not naturally serve, while steamboats continued to handle bulk cargo over the routes where water transport remained more economical. The Mississippi River trade, in particular, retained significant importance well into the 1850s, even as Eastern railroad networks expanded. The cotton economy of the lower Mississippi Valley, the agricultural production of the upper valley, and the manufacturing centers along the Ohio River all continued to depend heavily on steamboat transport throughout this period. In many respects, the 1850s represented not the decline of the steamboat trade, but its absolute commercial peak, with more steamboats operating on the Mississippi system than at any previous point in history. But underlying trends were shifting even during this apparent peak. Railroad mileage in the United States grew explosively during the 1850s, expanding from roughly 9,000 miles at the start of the decade to over 30,000 miles by its end. Much of this growth occurred in the states bordering the Mississippi Valley itself, as railroad companies built lines connecting interior agricultural regions directly to eastern markets, bypassing the river route entirely for an increasing share of commercial traffic. The Civil War somewhat paradoxically accelerated this underlying shift, even while temporarily disrupting Mississippi River commerce through military conflict. The war years saw enormous federal investment in railroad construction and improvement, driven by the immediate military necessity of moving troops and supplies quickly across the country. The strategic value of railroads for rapid troop deployment was demonstrated repeatedly throughout the conflict, and this demonstrated value translated directly into continued investment and expansion once the war concluded. In the decades following the Civil War, often referred to as the Gilded Age, American railroad expansion proceeded at a pace that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Total railroad mileage in the United States grew from around 35,000 miles immediately after the war to well over 160,000 miles by the early 1990s. This network increasingly connected every significant agricultural region, every major city, and every important resource extraction site directly to national and even international markets, without requiring goods to pass through the geographic choke point that New Orleans had represented for the better part of 2 centuries. The economic consequences for the Mississippi River trade were profound, though they unfolded gradually rather than suddenly, which is precisely why this entire story deserves the patient, unhurried treatment we have been giving it.
Railroads offered several specific advantages over steamboats that cumulatively proved decisive over time. They were not dependent on water levels, which fluctuated seasonally and could make river transport unreliable or impossible during periods of drought, or conversely, during dangerous flood conditions. They were not limited to the geographic paths that rivers happened to follow, allowing railroad companies to build direct connections between any 2 points that justified the investment. They operated on fixed schedules with a reliability that river transport, subject to the whims of weather and water conditions, could rarely match.
And critically, as railroad technology and competition both matured through the latter half of the 19th century, rail freight rates fell steadily, eventually becoming competitive with, and in many cases cheaper than, river transport for a wide range of goods. The grain trade of the upper Mississippi Valley and the broader Midwest illustrates this shift particularly clearly. In the early steamboat era, grain grown in Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin had typically moved by river south to New Orleans for export or eastern distribution. By the 1870s and 1880s, an increasing share of this same grain was moving instead by rail directly eastward to Chicago, which grew explosively during this period, specifically because of its position as a railroad hub connecting the agricultural Midwest to the population centers and ports of the eastern United States. Chicago's rise during this period stands as perhaps the single clearest illustration of the broader transformation underway. The city had been a relatively minor settlement through the early steamboat decades, lacking the kind of direct river access to the Mississippi system that had made cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati so important. But Chicago's position relative to the expanding railroad network, combined with its access to Great Lakes shipping, allowed it to become one of the most important commercial cities in the entire country by the 1880s, eclipsing river cities that had once seemed unassailable in their economic importance. St. Louis, by contrast, offers an instructive cautionary example. The city had grown enormously during the steamboat era, specifically because of its strategic position on the river system, and its business leaders and political figures were, for a time, deeply ambivalent about embracing railroad development, fearing correctly that railroads would ultimately undermine the river-based commercial advantages that had made the city prosperous in the first place. This ambivalence, combined with decisions by major railroad companies to route their most important lines through Chicago rather than St. Louis, contributed to St. Louis gradually losing ground to Chicago as the dominant commercial center of the American Midwest, even though St. Louis retained considerable importance throughout this period. This pattern repeated itself, with variations, in river city after river city throughout the Mississippi Valley. Cities and regions that successfully integrated themselves into the expanding railroad network tended to maintain or even grow their economic importance. Cities and regions that remained primarily dependent on river transport, whether due to geography, local political resistance, or simple economic inertia, tended to see their relative importance decline, even in cases where the absolute volume of their river trade remained substantial for decades to come. It would be a mistake, however, to characterize this period simply as the railroad replacing the steamboat in any complete or final sense. The Mississippi River trade did not disappear, it transformed, adapting to a new competitive landscape in ways that preserved an important, if diminished, role for water transport within the broader American transportation system. By the late 19th century, river transport on the Mississippi was increasingly specializing in exactly the kind of cargo where its inherent advantages, the ability to move enormous volumes of heavy, low-value bulk goods at very low cost per ton, remained genuinely competitive with rail. Coal, grain, and eventually petroleum products became the dominant cargoes of river transport, moved not by the elegant passenger steamboats of the antebellum Golden Age, but increasingly by barges, towed in long, connected strings by powerful towboats that bore little resemblance to the steamboats of the earlier era. This shift toward bulk barge transport represents the next major chapter in our story, one that would ultimately require massive federal investment in engineering the river itself, building locks, dams, and channel improvements on a scale that the early steamboat captains, navigating by instinct and local knowledge, could scarcely have imagined. We will explore that engineering transformation and the 20th century reshaping of the Mississippi into the heavily managed commercial waterway we know today as we continue this story.
There is a particular moment in this story where the relationship between human beings and the Mississippi River fundamentally changes. For nearly 2 centuries, from the earliest flatboat crews through the steamboat captains who learned to read every sandbar and snag by instinct and hard experience, people had related to the Mississippi as something to be navigated, something powerful and unpredictable, to be understood, respected, and worked around, but never truly controlled. The river did what rivers do, and human commerce adapted itself to that reality as best it could. The 20th century brought a different ambition entirely. Not simply to navigate the river, but to engineer it. To take an enormous, wild, constantly shifting natural system and rebuild it, piece by piece, into something more predictable, more reliable, and more useful for the specific purposes of modern commercial navigation. Before we continue into this remarkable engineering story, I want to pause and speak with you directly for a moment, as I always do at this point in the journey. These videos require an enormous amount of careful research because the goal is always to get the real texture of history right, not just the broad strokes. If you have been enjoying this deep dive into the Mississippi so far, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It is the most meaningful way to support this kind of long-form historical storytelling, and it takes only a few seconds. Now, let us return to the river, because its transformation into an engineered waterway is one of the most consequential and least appreciated achievements in American infrastructure history. By the late 19th century, it had become clear to engineers, shippers, and government officials alike that the natural Mississippi River, for all its commercial importance, presented serious and persistent obstacles to efficient navigation. The river's depth varied enormously by season and by location. During periods of low water, which occurred predictably during summer and early autumn in many stretches, the channel could become too shallow for loaded vessels to pass safely, forcing boats to lighten their cargo or wait for better conditions. During periods of high water, the river could flood catastrophically, as it had during the New Madrid earthquake era, and would continue to do throughout American history, destroying property, disrupting commerce, and in the worst cases, costing enormous numbers of lives. The river also moved. Its channel was not a fixed feature of the landscape, but a constantly shifting boundary, eroding banks in one location while depositing sediment and creating new sandbars in another. A channel that was deep and reliable one year might become impassable the next, as the river's own sediment load reshaped the riverbed in ways that were difficult to predict and harder still to control without sustained intervention. The federal government's involvement in managing these challenges developed gradually, building on earlier and more limited efforts. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been involved in river improvement work on the Mississippi system since at least the 1820s, when Congress first authorized funding to remove snags and other obstacles to navigation. Henry Shreve himself, the engineer whose steamboat design innovations had been so important to the earlier steamboat era, later worked for the Corps of Engineers on exactly this kind of river clearing and improvement work, an interesting continuity between the earlier story of steamboat technology and the later story of river engineering. But these early efforts were modest in scope compared to what would follow in the 20th century.
The fundamental shift came as a combination of factors converged. Continued reliance on the river for bulk commodity transport, even as railroads dominated higher-value freight. Growing concern about catastrophic flooding, dramatically intensified by the enormous and devastating Mississippi River flood of 1927, which inundated huge areas of the lower Mississippi Valley, displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and exposed the inadequacy of existing flood control measures in the starkest possible terms. And a developing federal philosophy, particularly during the New Deal era of the 1930s, that large-scale public infrastructure investment was both an appropriate and necessary function of the federal government. The response to the 1927 flood specifically reshaped federal policy toward the river in fundamental ways. The Flood Control Act of 1928 authorized a massive program of levee construction, floodway development, and channel improvement along the lower Mississippi, placing the Army Corps of Engineers in a central and ongoing role as the primary federal agency responsible for managing the river's behavior. This represented a significant expansion of the federal government's relationship with the river, moving well beyond the earlier, more limited focus on simply clearing navigation hazards. Simultaneously, a parallel and equally significant engineering effort was underway on the upper Mississippi, focused not primarily on flood control, but on creating a reliable, year-round navigation channel suitable for modern commercial barge traffic. This effort centered on a technology that fundamentally changed how the river functioned as a commercial waterway. The lock and dam system.
A lock and dam system addresses the problem of variable river depth through a relatively elegant engineering solution. A dam is built across the river, creating a pool of consistently deep water upstream of the structure, similar in concept to a staircase of contained water levels rather than a single, continuously sloping river surface. Where boats need to pass from one pool to the next, a lock, essentially a chamber with gates at each end, allows a vessel to enter, have the water level inside the chamber raised or lowered to match the elevation of the pool on the other side, and then exit into that adjusted pool, having effectively climbed or descended a step in the river's elevation, without needing to fight an uncontrolled current or navigate a stretch of unpredictably shallow water. Beginning seriously in the 1930s, the Army Corps of Engineers constructed a system of 29 locks and dams along the upper Mississippi River, stretching from Minneapolis down to roughly St. Louis, where the river's depth and volume, fed by the Missouri and other major tributaries, became sufficient to support navigation without this kind of artificial staircase management. This system, largely completed by the early 1940s, transformed the upper Mississippi from a river whose navigability varied dramatically by season into a managed waterway that could reliably support commercial barge traffic essentially year-round, except during the most extreme conditions of flood or freeze. This engineering achievement is, in a very real sense, the foundation on which the modern Mississippi River barge industry was built. Without a reliable, predictable channel depth, the kind of large-scale, scheduled, bulk commodity shipping that characterizes contemporary river commerce would simply not be commercially viable. The locks and dams of the upper Mississippi, unglamorous and largely unknown to the general public, represent one of the most economically consequential infrastructure investments in the history of American interior transportation. The lower Mississippi, below St. Louis, required a different engineering approach, since the river's volume in this stretch was generally sufficient to support navigation without a lock and dam staircase system. But the more serious challenges of channel stability and catastrophic flooding demanded a different set of interventions.
Here, the Army Corps of Engineers pursued an extensive program of channel stabilization, building structures called wing dams and revetments designed to control where and how the river deposited and eroded sediment, effectively training the river to maintain a more consistent and predictable channel rather than wandering unpredictably across its floodplain as it had done for millennia. Enormous systems of levees were constructed and continuously raised and reinforced along both banks of the lower river, intended to contain floodwaters that might otherwise spread across the wide natural floodplain that had historically absorbed excess water during high water periods. This levee construction program, while highly effective at protecting specific areas from flooding under normal and even moderately severe conditions, introduced its own significant complications, ones that engineers and policymakers continue to grapple with today. By preventing the river from spreading across its natural floodplain during high water events, levees concentrate floodwater in a narrower channel, which can actually increase the height and the force of flooding within that contained channel during the most extreme events. The interconnected system of levees, in other words, solves the problem of routine flooding quite effectively, while potentially making catastrophic, low-probability flooding events even more severe when they do eventually occur. A sobering engineering trade-off that the lower Mississippi flood control system embodies to this day. The combined effect of all of this 20th century engineering work, the upper river lock and dam system and the lower river levee and channel stabilization program, was to transform the Mississippi from the wild, unpredictable, seasonally variable river that the flatboat crews and steamboat captains had navigated by hard-won experience into something closer to a managed industrial waterway, engineered specifically to support reliable, predictable, large-scale commercial navigation. This engineered river made possible an entirely new form of Mississippi River commerce, one that looked nothing like the elegant passenger steamboats of the antebellum Golden Age, but that moved a volume of cargo that those earlier steamboat captains could scarcely have imagined. The modern towboat and barge system, which we will explore closely in our next part, represents the final major chapter in this long story of transformation, the form that Mississippi River commerce has taken in the modern era, built on top of nearly 2 centuries of accumulated technological and engineering change. We will turn to that modern system and to the broader question of what the Mississippi River trade means for the American economy today as we continue this story.
If you stood on the bank of the Mississippi River today, somewhere along one of its long, quiet stretches between major cities, you would likely see something that at first glance might seem almost unremarkable. A long, low string of rectangular steel vessels connected together and riding low in the water, moving slowly downstream or upstream, pushed from behind by a single, comparatively small but powerfully built vessel with a tall pilot house. There is no smokestack belching black coal smoke, no ornate decoration, no passengers waving from upper decks. There is, in fact, very little that would catch the eye of a casual observer at all. And yet what you would be looking at represents the culmination of everything this story has been building toward. The modern towboat and barge system. The final form that nearly 2 centuries of technological evolution, economic pressure, and engineering investment have produced on the Mississippi River. Before we continue into this final major chapter of our story, I want to take a moment to speak with you directly, as I have throughout this journey. Putting together a series like this requires sustained, careful research, because I want every part of this story to hold up to real scrutiny, not just sound good in the moment.
If this deep dive into the Mississippi has been worth your time, please subscribe to the channel now. It is the clearest way to tell me that this kind of patient, long-form history is worth continuing to make, and it costs you nothing at all. Now, back to the river and to the system that defines its commercial life today. The modern barge is, in a sense, a direct descendant of the original flatboat, sharing the same basic logic of a flat-bottomed vessel optimized for carrying maximum cargo volume with minimal draft. But the similarities largely end there. A contemporary river barge is constructed of welded steel rather than wood, is designed for repeated long-term use rather than a single one-way journey, and is built to standardized dimensions that allow multiple barges to be connected together into larger flotillas, sometimes called tows, that can be moved as a single coordinated unit by one towboat. A typical Mississippi River barge can carry approximately 1,500 tons of cargo, an amount that is genuinely difficult to put into perspective without a comparison. 1,500 tons is roughly equivalent to the cargo capacity of 15 large railroad jumbo hopper cars, or roughly 60 large semi-tractor trailer trucks. A single standard barge, in other words, can move as much cargo as a substantial convoy of trucks, using a fraction of the fuel per ton of cargo moved. And barges on the Mississippi rarely travel alone. Modern towboats, especially on the lower river, below St. Louis where channel depth permits larger formations, commonly push tows consisting of 20, 30, or even 40 individual barges lashed together into a single rectangular formation that can stretch the length of several city blocks and carry the cargo equivalent of well over 1,000 semi-trucks moved by a single towboat crew. This astonishing efficiency is the central economic fact that explains why river transport, despite having been displaced from its historical dominance by railroads more than a century ago, remains a genuinely important part of the American transportation system today. The fundamental physics that made water transport advantageous in the earliest days of the flatboat trade, the simple reality that moving heavy cargo through water requires dramatically less energy than moving the same cargo across land, remains just as true today as it was in the 1700s. Modern engineering has simply found new and far more efficient ways of taking advantage of that basic physical reality. The cargo that moves along the modern Mississippi reflects this efficiency specialization clearly. Bulk agricultural commodities, particularly corn and soybeans grown throughout the Midwest, remain one of the dominant categories of river cargo, moved from grain elevators along the upper and middle Mississippi down to export terminals near New Orleans, where the grain is transferred onto ocean-going ships for export to international markets. This pattern, agricultural surplus from the interior moving downstream toward New Orleans for export, is a direct echo of the very earliest flatboat trade we discussed at the beginning of this story, even though almost every technological detail of how that movement happens has changed beyond recognition. Petroleum products, coal, various chemicals, and construction materials like sand, gravel, and cement round out the major categories of modern river cargo. What unites all of these commodities is their character as heavy, relatively low value per ton bulk goods, exactly the kind of cargo for which water transport's efficiency advantage remains decisive even in competition with modern rail and truck transport. High-value manufactured goods, electronics, Time-sensitive shipments and most consumer products move overwhelmingly by truck and rail today, where speed and flexibility matter more than the absolute cost per ton of moving heavy bulk material.
The economic scale of this modern river commerce, while certainly smaller in relative national importance than the Mississippi River trade was during its 19th century peak, remains genuinely substantial. The Mississippi River system collectively moves several 100 million tons of cargo annually, supporting a complex economic ecosystem of grain elevators, port terminals, towing companies, and shipbuilding and repair facilities concentrated in river towns up and down the system. Many of them the very same towns that grew to prominence during the steamboat era a century and a half earlier. The towboat industry itself developed its own distinctive culture and way of life, one that in certain respects echoes the boatman culture of the much earlier flatboat era, even as the actual work bears little resemblance. Modern towboat crews typically work extended rotations, commonly 30 days on the boat followed by 30 days off, living aboard the vessel for the duration of their working period. The work requires genuine specialized skill, particularly for the pilots responsible for navigating large tow formations through the river's locks, bridges, and the inherently complex hydrodynamics of pushing a large, somewhat unwieldy rectangular formation of connected barges through a winding natural channel. Passing through the lock and dam system on the upper river, the very infrastructure we discussed in our previous part, remains one of the most demanding and time-consuming aspects of modern river navigation. A large modern tow is often too long to fit through a single lock chamber in one piece, requiring the towboat crew to break the tow apart, move sections through the lock separately, and reassemble the full tow on the other side, a process that can take several hours for a single lock passage and that must be repeated at each of the 29 locks along the upper river. This is, in its own way, a modern echo of the patience and physical labor that has characterized Mississippi River commerce throughout its entire history, even as the specific technology involved has changed beyond all recognition. The river's relationship with railroads and trucking, the technologies that displaced its 19th century dominance, has also evolved into something more genuinely complementary than the older narrative of simple competition and decline might suggest. Modern logistics increasingly relies on what is sometimes called intermodal transportation, in which goods move via whichever combination of rail, truck, and water transport proves most efficient for a given route and cargo type, often switching between modes at specialized transfer terminals. Grain grown in Iowa might travel by truck from the farm to a local elevator, then by rail to a river terminal, then by barge down to New Orleans, then by ocean vessel to an international buyer, with each mode of transport handling the portion of the journey for which it is best suited. This intermodal reality represents, in many ways, a kind of resolution to the long competitive story we have traced throughout this series. The flatboat gave way to the steamboat. The steamboat lost its dominance to the railroad, but neither the river nor the railroad ever actually disappeared. Instead, American transportation infrastructure gradually evolved into a genuinely integrated system, where water, rail, and eventually highway transport each occupy the specific economic niche where their particular advantages matter most, working together rather than existing in pure zero-sum competition. The environmental dimension of this modern river commerce deserves mention as well, because it connects directly back to the engineering story we explored in the previous part of this series. The heavily managed, leveed, and channelized Mississippi that makes reliable modern barge transport possible is also a river whose natural ecological functioning has been profoundly altered by that same management.
The wetlands and natural floodplains that once absorbed seasonal flooding and supported enormous biodiversity have been significantly reduced by levee construction. Sediment that once naturally rebuilt the Louisiana coastline is now largely channeled directly out into the Gulf of Mexico by the engineered contained river channel, contributing to the alarming rate of coastal land loss that southern Louisiana has experienced over the past century. These environmental trade-offs represent an ongoing and genuinely difficult policy challenge, one that engineers, scientists, and policymakers continue to wrestle with today as they attempt to balance the genuine economic value of reliable commercial navigation against the genuine ecological and coastal protection value of a more naturally functioning river system. There are no easy answers here, and the debate over how to balance these competing priorities will likely continue for as long as the river itself continues to flow. As we bring this long journey to its conclusion in our next and final part, we will step back from the specific technical and economic details we have traced so carefully across these chapters and consider the broader meaning of this story. What 2 centuries of transformation along the Mississippi River trade tell us about American economic development more generally, about the relationship between technology and geography, and about the surprisingly persistent ways that the patterns established in the earliest days of the flatboat trade continue to echo in the river commerce of today. We will bring this remarkable story to its close together.
We have traveled a very long way together, and it seems fitting as we reach the end of this journey to look back at the full distance we have covered. We began with a flatboat crew loading barrels of flour and crates of whiskey onto a crude wooden vessel, trusting nothing but the current itself to carry their year's labor toward a market hundreds of miles away. We watched a strange mechanical sound drift around a river bend in Natchez in 1812, announcing a technology that would solve a problem the flatboat could never overcome. We sat with the genuine triumph and the genuine darkness of the steamboat's golden age, a period of extraordinary commercial vitality built in significant part on the forced labor of enslaved people. And we watched that same river become a central strategic prize in the war that would finally end that institution. We traced the slow, almost imperceptible rise of the railroad, a technology that did not need the river at all, and we watched cities rise and fall depending on how well they adapted to that shift. And we saw the river itself rebuilt piece by piece, lock by lock, levee by levee, into the engineered commercial waterway that carries grain and coal and petroleum past our towns today, pushed along by towboats that owe their basic logic to flatboats built 200 years before them. If there is one thread that runs through all of this, it is something worth sitting with for a moment. Technology changes constantly. The river does not. The Mississippi itself, in its basic physical reality, has remained the enormous, central, gravity-driven channel draining the heart of a continent since long before any human being arrived to make use of it. What has changed again and again across 2 centuries is the technology human beings have built to work with that unchanging geography. The flatboat, the steamboat, the railroad, the lock and dam, the diesel towboat, each one solved the limitations of what came before, and each one created new economic winners and new economic losers in the towns and cities that depended on the river for their livelihood. This pattern is not unique to the Mississippi. It is, in many ways, a pattern that runs through the entire history of American infrastructure, and indeed through the history of infrastructure everywhere.
Geography sets the terms. Technology determines how effectively human beings can work within those terms. And the wealth, opportunity, and daily life of ordinary people gets reshaped, sometimes gradually and sometimes with startling speed, by the interaction between the two. What makes the Mississippi's version of this story so rich, I think, is its sheer duration and visibility. We can trace with real clarity the exact moment a steamboat first conquered the river's current. We can point to the specific flood and the specific legislation that triggered a fundamental shift in federal policy toward the river. We can watch Chicago overtake St. Louis in real time through the historical record, as one city embraced the railroad and the other hesitated. Few stories give us this clean a window into the slow mechanics of economic transformation. There is also something quietly moving about the continuities that persist underneath all this change. Grain still moves down the Mississippi toward New Orleans for export, just as it did in the earliest days of the flatboat trade, even though every detail of how it gets there has been completely reinvented. River towns still organize significant parts of their economic and social life around the rhythms of the water, even if those rhythms are now managed by engineers rather than dictated purely by nature. The river is still, in the most fundamental sense, doing the same job it has always done, carrying the wealth of the interior toward the sea and carrying the world's goods back in return. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with me, tracing this long and patient story from its earliest beginnings all the way to the modern day. Stories like this take a great deal of careful work to put together properly, and the fact that you stayed with it from beginning to end means more than you probably realize. If something in this series stayed with you, if you learned something you did not expect, or simply enjoyed the slow, unhurried pace of this kind of deep history, please take a moment to like this video. It is a small action, but it tells me, and it tells others who might enjoy this kind of content, that this story was worth telling. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please do so now. Every subscriber helps make it possible to keep producing long, carefully researched histories like this one. It takes only a moment, and it makes a genuine difference. If you know someone who would appreciate a story told at this pace, about a subject as ordinary and as profound as a river, please share this with them. The best histories are the ones that get passed from one curious person to another. There are more rivers, more roads, more quiet and overlooked corners of history still waiting to be explored. I hope you will join me for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thank you again for watching all the way to the end.
Think for a moment about the last time you drove somewhere far away. Maybe it was a long stretch of interstate, the kind where the landscape rolls by for hours at a steady, hypnotic pace. Maybe it was a quiet two-lane road through farmland, or a winding mountain route, or a stretch of pavement through the desert where the horizon seems to stretch on forever in every direction. Wherever it was, you were almost certainly traveling on something that did not exist in anything like its current form before the 20th century. The road beneath your tires has a history, a long, slow, surprisingly dramatic history, filled with stubborn engineers, ambitious politicians, forgotten activists, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted a way to get from one place to another without their wagon wheels sinking into mud up to the axle. This is the story of how that road came to exist, how the United States transformed itself over the course of roughly a century into a country where a journey of 50 miles could take an entire exhausting day, into a country defined, in many real ways, by the speed and freedom of its roads. It is a quiet kind of history, the kind that rarely makes it into the textbooks because no single dramatic battle or single charismatic leader can fully explain it. It is instead the story of thousands of small decisions, local disputes, federal compromises, and gradual technological shifts accumulating slowly over decades until an entirely new way of life had been built, almost without anyone fully noticing it happening in real time. Let us begin, as these stories so often do, somewhere unglamorous, with mud. Before we go any further, I want to take just a moment to speak with you directly, the way I try to do at the start of every one of these long histories. Putting together a story like this takes a genuinely significant amount of research, because I care about getting the real texture of the past right, not just the broad outline everyone already knows. If you are the kind of person who enjoys settling in for a long, unhurried journey through history, something to listen to while you relax or drift toward sleep, then this channel was made for you. I would be sincerely grateful if you took a moment right now to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is the clearest way to tell me that this kind of slow, careful storytelling is worth continuing to make. Now, let us return to the mud. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was, by any reasonable standard, a country of terrible roads. This might be surprising to hear, given how thoroughly road travel defines American life today. But in 1900, the vast majority of roads connecting American towns, farms, and cities were unpaved, ungraded, and essentially unmanaged. They were dirt tracks, maintained inconsistently by local townships and counties, with limited budgets and even more limited expertise in road engineering. In dry weather, these roads were merely uncomfortable, choked with dust kicked up by wagon wheels and horse hooves. In wet weather, they became something closer to a genuine obstacle, transformed into mud so deep and so persistent that wagons could become stuck for hours, sometimes requiring teams of horses or even oxen simply to haul a stranded vehicle free. The condition of American roads at this time reflected a simple economic and political reality. Road maintenance in the United States had historically been a local responsibility, falling to townships, counties, and in some cases individual property owners who were obligated to maintain the stretch of road adjacent to their own land. This decentralized system had developed organically over more than 2 centuries of American settlement, and it had never been seriously reconsidered, because for most of that history, it had been more or less adequate for the needs of the people using the roads. Farmers needed roads good enough to haul crops to a local market or a nearby railroad depot. Most other long-distance travel, for people and for freight, was handled by railroads, which had expanded into an enormous, sophisticated national network throughout the second half of the 19th century, as we explored in considerable detail in our previous series on the Mississippi River trade and its eventual displacement by rail. Given that railroads handled the heavy lifting of long-distance transportation, there was relatively little political pressure to invest serious money in improving the roads that existed primarily to connect farms to the nearest rail line. This arrangement, imperfect as it was, had persisted for generations, and then, within the span of roughly 2 decades, it became utterly inadequate.
The reason was a machine that, at the turn of the century, existed mostly as a novelty and a curiosity for the wealthy: the automobile. In 1900, there were perhaps 8,000 automobiles registered in the entire United States, an almost negligible number in a country of 76 million people. Automobiles were expensive, mechanically unreliable, and were viewed by much of the public as a plaything for the rich, an object of curiosity rather than a serious tool of daily transportation. Horses, after all, did not need to be cranked to start, did not break down on lonely stretches of road, and could navigate the deep mud and rutted surfaces of existing American roads with far more reliability than these early, fragile machines.
But the automobile did not remain a curiosity for long. Henry Ford's introduction of the Model T in 1908, combined with his relentless drive to reduce manufacturing costs through the moving assembly line, transformed the automobile within a single decade from an expensive luxury into a genuinely attainable purchase for a large and rapidly growing share of the American middle class. By 1910, there were roughly 400,000 automobiles registered in the United States. By 1920, that number had exploded to over 8 million. By 1930, it stood at well over 23 million. This explosive growth in automobile ownership created an entirely new and urgent political problem, one that the existing, decentralized, locally funded road system was completely unprepared to address. Millions of Americans now owned a machine specifically designed for rapid travel over roads, and those roads, in most of the country, remained dirt tracks that turned to impassable mud every time it rained. The mismatch between the automobile's capabilities and the roads available to it became almost immediately a subject of intense public frustration and, eventually, organized political action. One of the earliest and most interesting organized responses to this problem did not come from automobile owners at all, but from an entirely different and somewhat unexpected source: bicyclists. In the final decades of the 19th century, before the automobile had become widely available, the bicycle had experienced its own significant boom in American popularity. The bicycle craze of the 1880s and 1990s introduced millions of Americans to recreational long-distance travel by road. And bicyclists, perhaps more acutely than anyone else at the time, experienced firsthand just how poor the condition of American roads truly was. A rutted, muddy road that a horse and wagon could navigate with some difficulty was often genuinely impassable for a bicycle, whose narrow wheels and lack of substantial ground clearance made rough terrain a serious obstacle. Out of this frustration emerged the Good Roads movement, a genuinely significant but now largely forgotten political and social campaign that began in the 1880s and gathered considerable momentum through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. The League of American Wheelmen, a national bicycling advocacy organization founded in 1880, became one of the movement's central institutional voices, lobbying state and local governments for improved road construction and maintenance, publishing detailed technical literature on road engineering, and working to build broader public and political support for the idea that government, rather than individual property owners, should bear primary responsibility for building and maintaining decent roads. The Good Roads movement is a fascinating case study in how political momentum can shift unexpectedly. The movement began as a campaign primarily serving the interests of recreational bicyclists, a relatively narrow and not especially powerful political constituency.
But as automobile ownership expanded rapidly in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the same basic arguments the bicyclists had been making, that local, fragmented, underfunded road maintenance was inadequate for modern transportation needs, suddenly found an enormously larger and more politically influential audience among automobile owners, automobile manufacturers, and the rapidly growing industries that depended on reliable road transportation. Farmers, too, became important and somewhat unexpected allies in the good roads movement. Despite the fact that many rural Americans initially viewed automobiles with suspicion or outright hostility, resenting wealthy urban motorists who drove noisy, dust-raising machines through quiet farming communities and occasionally frightened livestock in the process. But farmers also understood, with increasing clarity as the early 20th century progressed, that better roads meant better access to markets, easier delivery of goods, and a meaningful reduction in the isolation that had long characterized rural American life. The same muddy roads that automobile enthusiasts found frustrating were the roads that farmers depended on to haul their crops to market, and the case for improvement, once articulated clearly, applied with equal force to both groups. By the early 1910s, this convergence of bicyclists, automobile owners, automobile manufacturers, and agricultural interests had built a political coalition with genuine national influence, one that was beginning to seriously challenge the long-standing assumption that road building and maintenance should remain a purely local responsibility. The federal government, for its part, had remained almost entirely uninvolved in road construction throughout the 19th century, a position rooted in genuine and long-standing constitutional debate about whether the federal government even possessed the authority to fund what were called internal improvements, a category that included roads, canals, and other infrastructure projects benefiting specific local areas rather than the nation as a whole. This was not merely an abstract legal question. Presidents going back to James Madison had vetoed federal infrastructure spending bills on precisely these constitutional grounds, and the question of the federal government's proper role in funding roads and other local infrastructure remained a genuinely contested and unresolved issue well into the 20th century. But the sheer scale of the automobile boom, combined with the mounting political pressure from the good roads movement and its increasingly powerful coalition of supporters, was about to force a fundamental reconsideration of this long-standing federal reluctance. In 1916, Congress passed the Federal Aid Road Act, a piece of legislation that, while modest by later standards, represented the first significant and sustained federal financial commitment to road improvement in American history. It would prove to be only the very beginning of a federal involvement in highway construction that would, over the following century, completely reshape the physical landscape of the United States. We will explore exactly how that involvement developed and the surprising twists and turns it took along the way as we continue this story.
There is a particular kind of legislation that does not change the world immediately, but quietly sets in motion a chain of events that will eventually change everything. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 was exactly this kind of law. It was not a dramatic piece of legislation. It did not generate sweeping headlines or capture the public imagination the way later highway initiatives eventually would. But it represented something genuinely new in American governance, a tentative but real federal commitment to the idea that the condition of the nation's roads was, in fact, a legitimate national concern, not merely a patchwork of local responsibilities best left entirely to townships and counties. Before we continue tracing this story, I want to pause, as I always do, and speak with you directly for just a moment. Building these long, detailed histories takes a great deal of patient research because I want every part of this story to feel grounded in real fact rather than simplified into something easy but inaccurate. If you have found this journey into the history of American roads worthwhile so far, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It is a small action that makes a genuinely meaningful difference in whether stories like this one continue to be told. Now, let us return to 1916 and to the law that quietly began the transformation of the American landscape. The Federal Aid Road Act, signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in July of 1916, established a system of matching grants under which the federal government would provide funding to individual states for road construction, provided that the states themselves committed an equal amount of their own funding to the same projects. This matching grant structure was, in many respects, a careful political compromise designed specifically to address the lingering constitutional concerns about federal involvement in what had traditionally been understood as a local and state responsibility. By structuring federal involvement as a partnership with the states rather than a unilateral federal program, the architects of the 1916 Act were able to sidestep, at least partially, the older constitutional objections that had haunted federal infrastructure spending since the earliest days of the Republic. The federal government was not simply building roads on its own initiative, it was helping states build roads that the states themselves had already decided to build, contributing funds to projects that state governments had identified, planned, and committed their own resources toward. This structural choice, the matching grant system, would prove to be one of the most consequential and durable innovations in the entire history of American highway policy. Variations of this same basic approach, federal funding paired with state matching contributions and state-level project selection and management, would continue to define the relationship between federal and state governments in highway construction for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st, right through to the interstate highway system we still rely upon today. The 1916 Act also required participating states to establish a state highway department, a dedicated government agency with professional engineering staff responsible for planning, constructing, and maintaining roads eligible for federal funding. This requirement had effects that extended well beyond the specific roads that received federal money. It effectively forced every state in the country to develop genuine institutional and professional expertise in road engineering, often for the very first time, creating a class of trained civil engineers and a body of accumulated technical knowledge about road construction that simply had not existed in any organized, systematic form before this period. Prior to this requirement, road construction and maintenance in most of the country had been handled, often quite literally, by local township officials with no formal engineering training, working with whatever crude tools and limited budgets their local government could provide. The quality of road construction varied enormously from one township to the next, depending almost entirely on the particular knowledge, competence, and resources of whoever happened to be responsible for roads in that specific jurisdiction. The establishment of professional state highway departments represented a genuine and significant step towards systematizing and professionalizing what had previously been an almost entirely amateur undertaking. The funding levels established by the 1916 Act were, by later standards, quite modest. The Act authorized $5 million in federal funding for its first year, rising gradually to $25 million annually by its fifth year, a meaningful sum for the time, but nowhere near sufficient to address the true scale of the road improvement challenge facing the country. Limiting the practical impact of the program even further, individual grants under the Act were capped at relatively low amounts per mile of road, and the Act specifically prioritized rural post roads, meaning roads used for the delivery of mail, which constrained how the funding could be applied. Implementation of the 1916 Act was further complicated almost immediately by world events entirely beyond the control of highway planners. The United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, less than a year after the Act was signed, and the shift toward wartime priorities significantly disrupted the early years of the federal highway program. Construction materials, skilled labor, and government attention were all redirected toward the war effort, slowing the implementation of road improvement projects across the country at precisely the moment the new federal program was attempting to gain meaningful traction. The war years did, however, produce one particularly vivid and widely publicized demonstration of just how inadequate American roads truly remained, even with federal involvement now officially underway. In the summer of 1919, the United States Army organized a transcontinental motor convoy, sending a large column of military vehicles from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California, traveling along the route of the Lincoln Highway, one of the earliest organized transcontinental automobile routes in the country, established originally in 1913 through private initiative rather than government action. The convoy's purpose was explicitly to test and publicize the practicality of long-distance military vehicle movement by road, a question of genuine strategic importance given the demonstrated value of motorized transportation during the recently concluded war in Europe. The convoy included 69 vehicles and approximately 300 soldiers, and among the officers participating in this grueling cross-country journey was a young lieutenant colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower. The journey was, by almost any measure, an ordeal. The convoy averaged barely 6 miles per hour over the course of the trip, and the entire journey from Washington to San Francisco took 62 days to complete, an almost unimaginable duration for a distance that a modern interstate highway traveler would cover in a matter of 2 or 3 days. The convoy encountered roads that were frequently impassable, bridges too weak to support the weight of military vehicles, and stretches of the supposedly established Lincoln Highway that were, in practical terms, barely distinguishable from the muddy farm tracks we discussed in our first part of this series. Eisenhower himself later wrote that this 1919 convoy experience left a lasting impression on him regarding the woeful inadequacy of American roads for any serious national purpose, whether military or civilian. This impression formed during a grueling 2-month journey across a country whose road infrastructure had clearly not kept pace with the rapid growth of automobile ownership and military motorization, would resurface decades later in a context of enormous historical consequence, one we will explore in considerable detail later in this series, when Eisenhower, by then President of the United States, became the driving political force behind the most ambitious highway construction program in American history. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, in the years immediately following the 1919 convoy and the conclusion of the First World War, the more immediate task facing highway planners and federal officials was making sense of an increasingly chaotic and confusing patchwork of named, privately organized automobile trails that had sprung up across the country in the years before any meaningful federal highway numbering or standardization system existed.
These early named trails, organizations like the Lincoln Highway Association, which had established and promoted the very route the 1919 convoys struggled to traverse, represented an interesting and now largely forgotten chapter in the early history of American road travel. Lacking any meaningful government coordination of long-distance routes, private associations of business owners, automobile enthusiasts, and local boosters had organized themselves throughout the 1910s to designate, mark, and promote specific cross-country automobile routes, often named with evocative titles intended to capture public imagination and, not incidentally, to direct automobile tourist traffic and the associated spending toward the specific towns that had paid dues to join the relevant trail association. The Lincoln Highway, established in 1913, was the most famous and arguably the most successful of these private trail associations, promoting a coast-to-coast route stretching from New York City to San Francisco. But it was far from alone. The Dixie Highway connected the Midwest to Florida. The National Old Trails Road followed portions of the historic Santa Fe Trail and National Road. Dozens of other named trails crisscross the country, each promoted by its own private association, each marked with its own distinctive colored bands painted on telephone poles and fence posts along the route, and each, in practice, frequently overlapping, intersecting, and creating genuine confusion for travelers attempting to navigate what amounted to a barely coordinated patchwork of private branding efforts rather than any kind of systematic national road network. This chaotic situation, dozens of competing named trails with overlapping routes and confusing, inconsistent local marking systems, became increasingly untenable as automobile ownership and long-distance automobile travel continued its explosive growth throughout the 1920s. The same basic problem that had originally motivated the Good Roads movement, the simple inadequacy of treating road planning as an exclusively local and uncoordinated matter, was reasserting itself in a new form. Now, instead of muddy roads that simply needed to be paved, the problem was a confusing, commercially driven jumble of competing private route designations that made systematic long-distance navigation genuinely difficult, even on roads that had been adequately improved. The solution that eventually emerged would replace this chaotic private trail system with something far more rational, standardized, and recognizably modern. A numbered federal highway system organized according to clear and consistent logical principles that would replace the colorful but commercially motivated trail names with something far more useful for ordinary travelers trying to find their way across an increasingly automobile-dependent country. We will explore the creation of that numbered highway system and the surprisingly contentious political battles involved in building it as we continue this story.
By the middle of the 1920s, American road travel had reached a strange kind of breaking point. The roads themselves were genuinely improving, slowly but steadily, thanks to the federal aid program established back in 1916 and the growing professional expertise of the new state highway departments. But the way those roads were organized, named, and signed remained a genuine mess. A traveler attempting to drive across several states might find themselves following the colored bands of the Lincoln Highway for 100 miles, only to have that route merge briefly with the Dixie Highway, diverge again, cross paths with some entirely different and more obscure named trail, and ultimately arrive at their destination only after a great deal of confused guesswork and frequent stops to ask local residents for directions.
Before we go further into how this confusion was finally resolved, I want to take a moment, as I always do, to speak with you directly. Stories like this one take real time to put together properly, because I want to honor the actual complexity of history rather than smoothing it over into something simpler but less true. If you have been enjoying this journey through the story of American roads, please take just a moment to subscribe to this channel. It is the clearest way to support this kind of slow, careful history, and it makes a genuine difference. Now, let us return to the chaos of the 1920s and to the system that was finally built to resolve it. The organization most directly responsible for untangling this mess was the American Association of State Highway Officials, a body formed in 1914 specifically to bring together the professional highway engineers and administrators from each state's newly established highway department, allowing them to coordinate on technical standards and increasingly on the broader question of how interstate roads ought to be organized and identified. Working in cooperation with the Federal Bureau of Public Roads, the agency within the United States Department of Agriculture that had been overseeing the federal aid highway program since 1916, this association undertook the ambitious task of designing an entirely new system for identifying significant interstate highways. Rather than colorful names chosen by private boosters with commercial interests in mind, this new system would use a simple, logical numbering scheme designed purely for clarity and ease of navigation. The numbering logic that emerged, finalized and formally adopted in 1926, was elegant in its simplicity. Major east-west routes would be assigned even numbers, with the most significant transcontinental routes receiving numbers ending in 0. Major north-south routes would be assigned odd numbers, with the most significant routes receiving numbers ending in 1 or 5. Numbering would generally increase from north to south for the north-south routes and from east to west for the east-west routes, creating a system where a traveler with even a rudimentary understanding of the numbering logic could make reasonable inferences about a road's general orientation and relative importance simply from its number, without needing to memorize an entire patchwork of colorful but logically arbitrary trail names. This new system was marked using a distinctive black and white shield-shaped sign, a design choice that itself represented a deliberate departure from the colored bands and decorative markers that the private trail associations had used. The shield was meant to convey official, government-sanctioned authority, a visual signal that this numbering system represented something fundamentally different from the commercially motivated trail branding that had preceded it. The transition from the old system of named trails to the new numbered highway system was not universally welcomed. The private trail associations, many of which had built genuine commercial and civic identities around their specific named routes, like the Lincoln Highway or the Dixie Highway, were understandably reluctant to see that branding replaced by what seemed to local boosters like a cold and impersonal number. But the practical advantages of the new system were significant enough that it gradually overcame this resistance, and by the early 1930s, the numbered highway system had become the dominant and broadly accepted framework for organizing significant interstate roads across the country. Among the numbers assigned during this 1926 reorganization was one that would go on to acquire a level of cultural significance far beyond what its original designers could possibly have anticipated: Route 66.
The designation of U.S. Route 66 connected Chicago, Illinois to Santa Monica, California, running diagonally across the country through Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona before reaching the Pacific coast. Its diagonal route, cutting across the grain of the primarily east-west and north-south oriented numbering grid, was itself a product of practical necessity, following a path that connected existing improved roads and population centers rather than adhering strictly to the cardinal directions implied by the broader numbering logic. In its earliest years, Route 66 was not yet the cultural icon it would later become. Significant stretches of the highway remained unpaved well into the 1930s, and the route passed through some of the most economically marginal and sparsely populated regions of the American Southwest. What transformed Route 66 from simply one numbered highway among many into something approaching a genuine cultural phenomenon was a specific and painful confluence of historical circumstances during the 1930s. The Dust Bowl, an environmental catastrophe caused by a combination of severe drought and decades of poor agricultural practices across the southern plains, devastated farming communities throughout Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and surrounding states beginning in the early 1930s. Hundreds of thousands of displaced farming families, suddenly unable to make a living from land that had become barren and wind-stripped, packed what belongings they could carry into automobiles and trucks and set out westward in search of work, most commonly toward the agricultural valleys of California. For an enormous number of these displaced families, Route 66 was the road they traveled. It became, in the words of the novelist John Steinbeck, whose 1939 novel about this migration brought the experience to a vast national audience, a road that came to symbolize both desperate flight and fragile hope, carrying families away from the ruined landscape of the Dust Bowl toward the uncertain promise of a new life in California. This association with the Dust Bowl migration gave Route 66 an emotional and symbolic weight that few other numbered highways ever acquired. But it was not the only historical force that shaped the road's eventual cultural prominence. The Second World War brought a different kind of significance to the route, as military mobilization, the establishment of training bases and defense industries across the Southwest, and the general wartime acceleration of cross-country travel and shipping all increased traffic along the highway considerably. It was in the post-war period, however, from the late 1940s through the 1950s and into the 1960s, that Route 66 reached the height of its cultural significance, becoming closely associated with the booming culture of American automobile tourism and the rapidly expanding American middle class's growing appetite for cross-country leisure travel. As automobile ownership continued its relentless post-war growth, and as paid vacation time became increasingly standard for American workers, the open road itself became a genuine cultural symbol, representing freedom, opportunity, and a distinctly American relationship between personal mobility and individual identity. Route 66, traversing some of the most visually striking and romantically evocative landscape in the entire country, from the rolling plains of Oklahoma through the painted deserts and dramatic rock formations of New Mexico and Arizona, became one of the most popular and most heavily promoted routes for this kind of automobile tourism. An entire commercial ecosystem grew up alongside the highway to serve these traveling families,
Motels with distinctive and often whimsically themed architecture, diners advertising home cooking to weary travelers, gas stations competing for business through colorful signage and promotional gimmicks, and roadside attractions ranging from the genuinely educational to the gloriously unapologetically kitschy. This roadside commercial culture, the motor courts and diners and novelty attractions that lined Route 66 and countless other American highways during this period, represented something genuinely new in American commercial life, an entire economy built specifically around the needs and the leisure desires of automobile travelers passing through on their way to somewhere else. Towns along Route 66, many of them small communities that had struggled economically for decades, found new prosperity by positioning themselves as welcoming stops for the steady stream of tourist traffic flowing along the highway. The cultural prominence of Route 66 during this period was further amplified by popular media, most notably a television series that aired from 1960 to 1964, which followed two young men traveling the highway in a Corvette convertible, encountering a different adventure and a different slice of American life in each episode. This show, along with popular songs and countless other references in American film, music, and literature throughout the mid-20th century, cemented Route 66 in the broader national imagination as something more than simply a numbered federal highway. It became, for several decades, perhaps the single most iconic road in the entire country, a kind of physical embodiment of the American romance with the open road and the freedom of automobile travel. And yet, even as Route 66 was reaching the absolute height of its cultural prominence during the 1950s and into the 1960s, the very system of numbered federal highways that had created it was already being quietly superseded by an entirely new and far more ambitious form of road infrastructure, one that would eventually render much of Route 66 itself functionally obsolete for the kind of long-distance travel it had once been built to serve. This new system traced its political origins back to a specific and historically significant figure we briefly encountered earlier in this story. A young lieutenant colonel who had endured the grueling 1919 transcontinental military convoy and who would eventually rise to become President of the United States, carrying with him a lasting conviction formed during that difficult 2-month journey decades earlier, that the United States desperately needed a genuinely modern, high-capacity national highway network. That conviction, combined with Cold War strategic concerns and the practical lessons of German Autobahn construction observed during the Second World War, would soon produce the most ambitious public works project in American history. The interstate highway system was coming, and it would transform the American landscape more completely and more permanently than any single piece of infrastructure before or since. We will turn to that transformation next.
There are moments in history when a single person's accumulated experiences, gathered across an entire lifetime, converge to produce a transformation far larger than anyone could have predicted at the time those experiences were actually happening. Dwight Eisenhower's relationship with American roads is exactly this kind of story. It began, as we discussed in an earlier part of this series, with a young lieutenant colonel enduring a brutal 62-day military convoy across roads that were frequently barely passable. It would end decades later,
with a sitting president of the United States signing into law the single largest public works program in the history of the nation, a program that would fundamentally and permanently reshape the physical landscape of the country. Before we trace exactly how this transformation occurred, I want to take a moment, as I do throughout this series, to speak with you directly. Putting together a long, detailed history like this one requires genuine care and sustained research, because I want every chapter of this story to actually hold up to scrutiny rather than simply sound satisfying. If you have found this exploration of American highway history worthwhile so far, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It is a small action, but it makes a real and meaningful difference in whether stories told at this pace continue to get made. Now, let us return to Eisenhower and to the experiences that shaped his thinking about American roads long before he ever became president. The 1919 transcontinental convoy was not the only formative road-related experience in Eisenhower's career. During the Second World War, as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, Eisenhower had direct and extensive personal experience with Germany's Autobahn network, the limited-access, high-speed highway system that Nazi Germany had constructed during the 1930s, originally for a combination of economic stimulus, propaganda, and explicit military mobilization purposes. Eisenhower observed firsthand how effectively the Autobahn system allowed for the rapid movement of military forces and equipment across considerable distances, a capability that stood in stark and uncomfortable contrast to his own earlier experience attempting to move a relatively modest military convoy across the United States in 1919. The Autobahn's design principles, controlled access points that prevented local traffic from interrupting the flow of through traffic, grade separation that eliminated dangerous intersections through the use of overpasses and underpasses, and generous, consistent engineering standards that allowed for sustained high-speed travel over very long distances, represented an entirely different conceptual approach to highway design than anything that existed in the United States at the time. This contrast between the impressive capability of the German Autobahn system and the inadequacy he had personally experienced on American roads decades earlier left a deep and lasting impression on Eisenhower, one that he carried with him through the remainder of his military career and into the presidency he would eventually assume in 1953. It would be a mistake, however, to attribute the creation of the interstate highway system entirely to Eisenhower's personal convictions, as compelling and as frequently cited as that narrative understandably is. By the time Eisenhower took office, a substantial body of professional, technical, and political groundwork had already been laid by highway engineers, federal officials, and members of Congress who had been studying and advocating for a genuinely modern, high-capacity national highway network for well over a decade. As early as 1939, the Bureau of Public Roads had produced a report, commissioned by Congress, examining the feasibility of a national system of toll superhighways. This report, along with a subsequent and more influential 1944 report titled Interregional Highways, laid out detailed technical and economic analysis supporting the construction of a national network of limited-access expressways connecting the country's major metropolitan areas. The 1944 report's recommendations were significant enough that Congress, in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944, formally authorized the designation of a 40,000-mile national system of interstate highways. Though crucially, this 1944 authorization included no dedicated federal funding mechanism to actually build the system it had designated, leaving the ambitious plan essentially a designation on paper for nearly another decade. This gap between an officially designated interstate highway system and the actual federal money needed to build it persisted throughout the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, frustrating highway planners and engineers who had done the detailed technical work necessary to plan the system, but who lacked the political consensus and dedicated funding mechanism required to move from planning into actual construction. Several factors converged during Eisenhower's presidency to finally break this long-standing impasse. Eisenhower's own personal conviction, rooted in his wartime and earlier military experiences, provided crucial executive leadership and political will at the highest level of government. But this personal conviction was reinforced by a powerful combination of additional practical considerations that had been building for years. The American economy, expanding rapidly during the post-war boom, was generating automobile traffic volumes that the existing highway infrastructure, even after decades of incremental federal aid improvements, was increasingly unable to handle adequately.
Traffic congestion in and around major American cities had become a genuine and worsening economic problem, with substantial costs in lost time, increased accident rates, and general inefficiency imposed on the rapidly growing volume of commercial and passenger vehicle traffic attempting to navigate an inadequate road network. Cold War strategic considerations also played a significant and explicitly acknowledged role in building political support for a comprehensive new highway system. With nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union representing a genuine and widely discussed national security concern throughout the 1950s, military planners and political leaders argued that a modern, high-capacity highway network was essential for effective civil defense purposes, allowing for the rapid evacuation of major urban population centers in the event of nuclear attack, and, equally important, allowing for the rapid movement of military personnel and equipment across the country during a national emergency. This Cold War justification was significant enough that the legislation eventually creating the interstate system officially designated it as the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, a name that explicitly reflected this strategic military rationale. Eisenhower, shortly after assuming the presidency, commissioned a special committee, chaired by retired Army General Lucius Clay, to study the highway question in detail and recommend a specific legislative path forward. The Clay Committee's 1954 report recommended a massive, accelerated 10-year construction program for the interstate system, financed through a combination of federal bonds and increased federal gasoline taxes, a financing approach that generated considerable congressional debate and required substantial additional negotiation before a final legislative consensus could be reached. The legislative process that followed the Clay Committee's report was genuinely complicated, involving extended negotiations over exactly how the enormous construction costs involved would actually be financed. The solution that eventually emerged and that proved durable enough to fund the interstate system through the following decades of its construction was the creation of a dedicated highway trust fund, financed primarily through federal taxes on gasoline and other motor fuels, along with additional taxes on tires, trucks, and other automotive products. This highway trust fund mechanism represented a genuinely elegant and politically durable financing solution. By directly linking the tax burden to actual road usage, since people who drove more and purchased more gasoline would pay proportionally more into the fund, the system created a financing structure that felt inherently fair to most taxpayers and that avoided drawing directly from general federal tax revenue, which made the program considerably easier to sustain politically across the many subsequent decades during which highway construction and maintenance costs continued to accumulate.
On June 29, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 into law, formally authorizing the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway, financed primarily through the newly established Highway Trust Fund, with the federal government covering 90% of construction costs and the states responsible for the remaining 10%, a funding split considerably more generous to the states than the 50-50 matching arrangement that had characterized the original 1916 federal aid program 4 decades earlier. This moment, the signing of the 1956 Act, is often cited as the formal beginning of the interstate system, and in terms of dedicated comprehensive federal funding, it genuinely was. But it is worth remembering, as we have traced throughout this series, that this moment represented not a sudden, isolated act of presidential vision, but rather the culmination of 4 decades of accumulated technical groundwork, political organizing, and gradually shifting public expectations about the proper role of the federal government in highway construction, beginning with the tentative federal aid program of 1916 and building steadily through the numbered highway system of the 1920s and the detailed planning reports of the late 1930s and 1940s. The scale of construction authorized by the 1956 Act was by any historical standard genuinely staggering. It represented at the time the largest public works project ever undertaken by any government in human history, eventually requiring an estimated total cost well over $100 billion across the decades of its construction, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, would represent several $100 billion in contemporary terms. The engineering standards established for the interstate system were equally ambitious, calling for divided highways with controlled access, meaning entry and exit only at specifically designated and engineered interchanges rather than at every intersecting local road. Grade separation eliminated at-grade railroad crossings and minimized dangerous intersections. Generous lane widths, gentle curves, and carefully engineered grades were designed to accommodate sustained high-speed travel safely. These standards, directly inspired by Eisenhower's observations of the German Autobahn system over a decade earlier, represented a genuinely new conceptual approach to American road design, fundamentally different from the older numbered highway system that had simply connected and improved upon pre-existing local roads. The actual construction of this enormous system would take far longer than the original 10-year timeline the Clay Committee had envisioned, ultimately stretching across more than 3 decades of sustained construction activity. And as this construction proceeded, year after year, decade after decade, it would produce consequences, some celebrated and some deeply controversial, that reshaped American cities, American suburbs, and American daily life in ways that went far beyond simply making it easier and faster to drive from one place to another. We will explore exactly how that construction unfolded and the complicated, sometimes painful legacy it left behind as we continue this story.
There is a particular kind of optimism that runs through the photographs and promotional films of the early interstate highway construction era in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Wide ribbons of fresh concrete cutting confidently through open countryside, ribbon-cutting ceremonies with local officials beaming for the cameras, promotional materials promising shorter commutes, safer travel, and a more connected, more prosperous nation, knit together by smooth, modern roads stretching from coast to coast. For many Americans living through this period, the interstate system genuinely represented unambiguous progress, a triumphant achievement of American engineering, and a tangible symbol of post-war prosperity and confidence. Before we explore both the genuine achievements and the considerable complications of this construction era, I want to pause for a moment, as I always do, to speak with you directly. Stories like this one require sustained, careful attention to detail, because history is rarely as simple as either pure triumph or pure tragedy, and I want to honor that complexity rather than flatten it. If this series has been worth your time, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It genuinely helps determine whether long, patient histories like this one continue to be made. Now, let us look closely at what the construction of the interstate system actually meant for the rural landscape it crossed and for the cities it ran directly through. In rural America, the construction of the interstate highway system unfolded largely as the optimistic promotional material suggested. New highways were built primarily through open countryside, farmland, and undeveloped land, requiring the acquisition of right-of-way from property owners, but generally avoiding the kind of widespread displacement of existing dense communities that would prove so consequential and so controversial in urban areas. The economic effects of interstate construction on rural and small-town America were significant and, in many respects, genuinely transformative. Towns that found themselves directly served by a new interstate interchange often experienced substantial new commercial development, as gas stations, motels, restaurants, and eventually larger retail establishments clustered around these interchange points to capture the traffic flowing along the new highway. This pattern created an entirely new category of American commercial geography, the interchange town, whose economic life became closely tied to its position along the interstate system. But this same pattern produced a corresponding and considerably less celebrated effect on towns that had previously depended on the older numbered highway system, including the once iconic Route 66 we discussed in detail earlier in this series. As interstate highways increasingly paralleled and eventually functionally replaced these older routes for long-distance travel, the steady stream of through traffic that had once sustained countless small towns and their associated motels, diners, and roadside attractions began to dry up. Redirected onto the new, faster, limited-access interstates running parallel to, but often several miles away from, the old route. This process unfolded gradually but relentlessly across the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s as interstate construction progressively replaced segment after segment of Route 66 and countless other older numbered highways across the country. Towns that had built their entire local economy around serving cross-country automobile travelers found themselves bypassed, sometimes quite literally, by traffic now flowing along an interstate route a few miles distant. Many of these towns experienced significant and often painful economic decline as a direct result, their motor courts and diners closing one by one as the traffic that had once sustained them disappeared. Route 66 itself was officially decommissioned as a U.S. highway in 1985, its various surviving segments absorbed into state and local road systems, even as the highway's cultural and nostalgic significance, ironically, seemed only to grow in the years that followed its official decommissioning. If the rural and small-town effects of interstate construction were complicated but relatively straightforward to understand, the effects on major American cities were considerably fraught, controversial, and consequential, generating debates and grievances that continue to shape American urban policy discussions to this day. The original interstate system plans called for highways to extend not just between cities, but directly into and through the urban cores of major American metropolitan areas, under the logic that effective regional transportation networks required highway access connecting directly to downtown business districts and other major urban destinations, not merely highways that circled around cities while leaving the actual urban core dependent on older, more congested local streets.
The selection of which urban neighborhoods would be demolished to make way for interstate construction was rarely random, and the patterns that emerged across numerous American cities during this period reveal something genuinely troubling about how these decisions were actually made. Highway planners and city officials, operating within the broader context of mid-20th century American racial segregation and discriminatory housing policy, disproportionately routed urban interstate construction directly through predominantly black and other minority neighborhoods, communities that, due to decades of discriminatory housing policy and lending practices, typically possessed less political power and fewer institutional resources to resist or meaningfully contest these routing decisions compared to wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods. This pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency in city after city throughout the country during the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s. In numerous metropolitan areas, thriving black business districts and residential communities, often among the most economically vibrant and socially cohesive black neighborhoods in their respective cities, were substantially or entirely demolished to make way for interstate construction, their residents displaced with what was, in many documented cases, demonstrably inadequate compensation and minimal meaningful input into the planning process that had decided their community's fate. The destruction was not merely physical, though the physical destruction itself was certainly profound, eliminating homes, businesses, churches, and other community institutions that had often taken generations to build. The social and economic damage extended considerably further, as interstate highways, once constructed, frequently created physical barriers that permanently divided neighborhoods, disrupted existing pedestrian and community connections, and depressed property values and economic activity in the areas immediately adjacent to the new highway corridors, effects that persisted for decades after the original construction, and that many affected communities are still working to address and remediate today. This pattern of urban highway construction did not go entirely unchallenged at the time, even though organized resistance frequently proved insufficient to alter the fundamental routing decisions that had already been made. Community organizations in numerous cities organized protests, legal challenges, and sustained political advocacy campaigns attempting to prevent or at least modify proposed highway routes that threatened to demolish their neighborhoods. Some of these efforts achieved genuine, if often partial, success. San Francisco's Embarcadero Freeway project was halted before completion following sustained community opposition. A planned expressway through New Orleans' historic French Quarter was successfully blocked. New York City's proposed Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have demolished substantial portions of what is now the Soho neighborhood, was ultimately defeated after years of organized community opposition. But these successful resistance efforts were, unfortunately, more the exception than the general rule. In far more cities across the country, planned urban interstate routes proceeded largely as originally designed, despite organized community opposition, resulting in the kind of widespread neighborhood demolition and displacement that has left a lasting and complicated legacy in American urban history, one that contemporary transportation planners, historians, and policymakers continue to study, debate, and, in some specific and notable cases, attempt to actively address and remediate through more recent highway removal and urban reconnection projects.
Beyond these urban displacement effects, the interstate highway system's construction also interacted with and significantly accelerated another enormous transformation already underway in post-war American society: the rapid growth of suburban development. The combination of new highway access, widespread automobile ownership, federal housing policies that favored new suburban single-family home construction over urban housing investment, and the displacement effects of urban highway construction itself all worked together to encourage and facilitate a massive post-war migration of population and economic activity away from established city centers and toward newly developing suburban areas, connected to those city centers primarily by the new interstate highways themselves. This suburban growth pattern, sometimes referred to by historians and urban planners as suburban sprawl, fundamentally reshaped the physical geography of American metropolitan areas across the second half of the 20th century. Cities that had historically developed in relatively dense, compact patterns centered around walkable downtown cores and public transit systems increasingly gave way to sprawling metropolitan regions organized primarily around automobile transportation and low-density suburban development, connected by an ever-expanding network of highways, both interstate and local, that made this kind of dispersed, automobile-dependent development pattern economically and practically feasible in the first place. This transformation, the relationship between highway construction and suburban sprawl, raises questions that remain genuinely contested among historians, urban planners, and policymakers today. Did highway construction primarily enable and accelerate suburban growth that would have happened regardless, due to other underlying economic and demographic forces? Or did the specific decision to build an extensive, federally subsidized highway system, rather than investing comparable public resources into urban public transit systems, actively shape and direct post-war development patterns in ways that might otherwise have unfolded quite differently? This question does not have a single, simple, universally agreed upon answer, and it continues to inform contemporary debates about transportation policy and infrastructure investment priorities across the country. What is considerably less contested, however, is the simple scale of the physical and social transformation that interstate highway construction produced across the United States during these decades. By the time the original interstate system was substantially completed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the basic shape of American metropolitan life, where people lived, how they traveled, where economic activity concentrated, and how communities related to one another physically and socially, had been fundamentally reshaped in ways that touched nearly every American, whether they personally experienced this transformation as opportunity, as disruption, or, as was true for a great many people, as some genuinely complicated combination of both. As we approach the conclusion of this long story, we will turn next to where the American highway system stands today, the ongoing challenges of maintaining this enormous infrastructure investment, the continuing debates over its legacy, and what the future of American road travel might look like as new technologies and new priorities begin to reshape the conversation once again.
We have traveled in this series across more than a century of American history. We began in the mud, on roads so poor that a wagon could become hopelessly stuck simply trying to cross a rural township in wet weather. We watched bicyclists, of all people, begin a political movement that automobile owners would later inherit and dramatically expand. We followed a young lieutenant colonel through a grueling 2-month transcontinental convoy in 1919, an experience that would quietly shape the course of American infrastructure decades later. We traced the rise of Route 66, a road that became, for a time, one of the most culturally resonant symbols of American identity itself,
and we watched it fade as a faster, more modern system gradually rendered it obsolete. And we examined, honestly and without flinching, both the genuine engineering triumph and the genuine human cost of the interstate highway system's construction through American cities and communities. Now, as we bring this long journey to its conclusion, let us look at where this story has actually arrived. At the interstate system as it exists today, the challenges it currently faces, and what its long, slow history might tell us about where American transportation is headed next. The interstate highway system, substantially completed by the early 1990s, today comprises roughly 48,000 miles of highway, carrying a quarter of all vehicle traffic in the United States, despite representing only about 1% of the country's total road mileage. This astonishing concentration of traffic onto a relatively small percentage of total roadway reflects exactly the kind of efficient, high-capacity, long-distance travel network that Eisenhower and the highway planners of the 1950s had originally envisioned. In purely functional terms, judged against its original transportation objectives, the interstate system represents one of the most successful infrastructure investments in American history. But success of this magnitude carries its own considerable burdens, and the most significant challenge facing the interstate system today is neither philosophical nor political in nature, at least not primarily. It is simply the unglamorous, persistent problem of aging infrastructure. Much of the interstate system was constructed during a concentrated burst of activity across the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, meaning that enormous portions of this system are now well over 50 years old, constructed using engineering standards, materials, and traffic volume assumptions that have, in many cases, been substantially exceeded by the realities of contemporary American traffic. Bridges, in particular, have emerged as a source of serious and ongoing concern, with thousands of interstate highway bridges across the country classified by federal engineering assessments as structurally deficient or in need of significant repair or replacement, a maintenance burden that has accumulated steadily as the system has aged, and that competes for limited funding against the ongoing costs of new construction and capacity expansion. This maintenance challenge connects directly back to the financing structure we discussed earlier in this series, the Highway Trust Fund, financed primarily through federal gasoline taxes established back in 1956. This financing mechanism, while genuinely elegant and durable for several decades, has run into a structural problem that its original architects could not have fully anticipated. The federal gasoline tax rate has not been increased since 1993, and meanwhile, vehicles have become substantially more fuel efficient, meaning drivers now pay less in gasoline tax per mile driven than they once did, even as construction and maintenance costs have continued to rise considerably due to ordinary inflation and the simply growing scale of an aging system requiring repair. The result has been a persistent and worsening funding shortfall, one that Congress has addressed repeatedly over the past 2 decades through a series of temporary supplemental appropriations from general federal revenue, rather than through any fundamental, lasting reform of the underlying financing mechanism. This funding challenge has become considerably more pressing with the continued growth of electric vehicle adoption, since electric vehicles, by definition, do not purchase gasoline and therefore do not contribute to the gasoline tax that has financed highway construction and maintenance for nearly 7 decades.
Policymakers and transportation economists continue to actively debate potential alternative financing mechanisms, including mileage-based user fees and various other approaches, though no single solution has yet achieved the kind of broad, durable political consensus that the original 1956 financing structure managed to secure. Beyond the purely financial and engineering challenges of maintaining an aging system, the interstate highway system's deeper social and urban legacy, the legacy we examined closely in our previous chapter, continues to generate active policy discussion and, in a growing number of specific cities, genuinely consequential action. In recent years, a number of American cities have begun seriously reconsidering and, in several notable cases, actively reversing the urban highway routing decisions made during the original construction era. Highway removal projects, in which an existing urban interstate segment is demolished and replaced with a boulevard, park space, or simply reconnected urban street grid, have been completed or are actively underway in cities including Rochester, New York, San Francisco, California, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, among others, with numerous additional cities currently studying similar proposals for their own urban interstate segments. These removal projects are typically motivated by a combination of factors, including the simple recognition that many of these aging urban highway segments are approaching the end of their structural lifespan and will require either complete reconstruction or removal regardless, combined with a renewed contemporary interest in urban redevelopment, walkability, and a more explicit reckoning with the historical pattern of disproportionate harm that urban highway construction inflicted on minority communities during the original construction era. The federal government itself, through targeted infrastructure legislation passed in the early 2020s, began for the first time providing dedicated federal funding specifically intended to support these kinds of urban highway reconnection and removal projects, representing a genuinely notable, if still relatively modest in overall scale, shift in federal transportation policy priorities after nearly 7 decades. Looking further ahead, the future of the American highway system will likely be shaped by technological forces that the original highway planners of the 1950s could scarcely have imagined. The continued growth of electric vehicle adoption raises not only the financing questions we discussed a moment ago, but broader questions about how highway infrastructure, rest stops, and charging networks will need to evolve to support a vehicle fleet increasingly powered by electricity rather than gasoline. The ongoing gradual development of autonomous vehicle technology raises its own distinct set of questions about how highway design, lane markings, signage, and traffic management might eventually need to adapt to accommodate vehicles capable of driving themselves, potentially altering traffic patterns, capacity requirements, and safety considerations in ways that remain genuinely difficult to predict with confidence today. What seems clear, looking back across the full sweep of this story, is that the relationship between American society and its roads has never actually been static. It has been, from the very beginning of this story, in the muddy, locally maintained roads of the early 20th century, through the Good Roads movement, the federal aid program, the numbered highway system, the rise and fall of Route 66, and the construction of the interstate system itself, a continuous process of adaptation, responding again and again to new technologies, new economic pressures, and new social priorities as they emerged. There is no reason to believe this process of adaptation has reached its conclusion simply because the original interstate system has been substantially built. The roads beneath our tires today are the product of more than a century of accumulated decisions, compromises, triumphs, and genuine mistakes. And the roads of the future will undoubtedly be shaped by decisions that are only beginning to be made today, in ways that we, looking forward from this present moment, can only partially anticipate. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with me, tracing this long and patient story of American roads from the mud of the early 20th century all the way to the complicated, aging, but still remarkable system that carries so much of American life today. Stories like this one take real time and real care to put together properly. And the fact that you have stayed with this journey from beginning to end means a genuine amount to me. If something in this series stayed with you, if you learned something you had not expected, or simply enjoyed settling into this slow, unhurried pace of historical storytelling, please take a moment to like this video. It is a small gesture, but it tells me clearly and directly that this kind of patient, careful history is worth continuing to make. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I would be sincerely grateful if you did so now. Every subscriber makes a genuine difference in whether long, carefully researched series like this one continue to get made, and it takes only a moment of your time. If you know someone who would enjoy a story told at this particular pace about something as ordinary and yet as quietly profound as the roads we drive every single day without ever really thinking about them, please share this with them. The best histories are the ones that travel from one curious person to the next. There are more roads, more rivers, and more overlooked corners of history still waiting for us to explore them together. I hope you will join me again for the next one. Until then, take care, and thank you again for staying with this story all the way to its end.